two belongs to you and me. When I talk for 2 minutes, I get the next 10 absolutely free with GT&T.
Program which looks at issues of interest to you. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Grantley Warren.
In part one of this discourse, our discussants, Dr. Henry Jeffrey and Mr. Vincent Alexander, spent some time examining the nature of the intractability, as it were, of our condition, meaning simply that nothing seems to be getting done, or very little, within the context of this new dispensation at all levels. Our parliament seemingly was not working. The executive seemingly could not operate with the existing parliament, and the judiciary was called into questionable interventions, as it were, on this impasse. In particular, to be bemoaned at that last discussion were questions of non-consultation, non-responsiveness, even when there was some measure of consultation. And even when there was apparent consensus, there were questions about the non-implementation of areas for consensus. Of course, all of this was set against the background that there apparently was very little recourse in the circumstances of non-implementation of agreed norms, whether they were by mutual consent or imposed by some judicial decision. The discussion at that time therefore said, we have to do something about these things or we will be damned. The next area of focus was generally recognizing the fact of our diversity and trying to understand whether, in fact, there were not some things that we just have to do to treat with this diversity. Among other things, we recognized that there was no sense of the development of a national culture, a national ethic, as opposed to it was a series of subcultures, as it were, that were being developed, and some of them not so real, not even ones that one could should embrace. Marginalization, disenfranchisement were thought to be operating within the context of what appears to be some sense of growing entitlement, and that was considered particularly bothersome given the fact of the diversity that the bicultural, the bipolitical nature of our country. Now, administrative control, questions of contract employment, etc., even as they affected the operations of the bureaucracy that was intended to service the thoughts of our political directorate, indicated that, among other things, that the bureaucracy was being undermined in a real sense, and that this notion of administrative control seems to be becoming another area of specific focus, even as one identified other locus of control, loci of control, meaning say the executive, the judiciary, etc., etc. The discussion closed on a non-responsiveness of the constitutional construct, especially the electoral laws, to the divisive political culture. In particular, just to the point of closure, the recognition of the plurality, giving the rights to the executive without consideration for the views of the majority, was an intractable problem, the most perhaps intractable problem of all, or rather encapsulate the essence of the nature of the intractability of our problem. And that is where we now turn to part 2 of this series. In part 1, as we just identified, and I would ask Vincent, perhaps you should start us off on this. We identified that the structure of governance and the political culture were areas that needed specific intervention.
Yes, Granty, we did. But there was a particular point where there was a departure of thinking between myself and Henry, when I made the point that constant articulation can sometimes entrap people and seem to have been pointing to a kind of a incremental, natural movement in a particular direction. And I just want slightly to go back to that point to emphasize that though things happen through the actions of people, that very often people are not able to predetermine the outcome of their actions, and very often the outcome is quite different from what they may have intended. And the point that I wanted to make then, and I'm repeating now, that once you have an interaction of forces taking place, whether they be intellectual or otherwise, that in itself lends to change and to some movement taking place, some developments occurring that may not have been intended. And the point I was making then, and I repeat now, that in Guyana, even as we confront these problems, and we have different sides taking different positions on these matters, that the interaction of those positions could still, in a very dialectical manner, lead to change that we may not foresee. You know, and one, in my mind, only has to look at recent events, even in, more particularly in places like Egypt, and see the rapidity with which change, some kind of change occurred that no one really projected would occur, and the occurrence of that had to do with the undercurrents which were interacting that suddenly became explosive, surfaced, and brought about change. So yes, we are going to need structural changes, but whether the structural changes will come about because we sit and craft them and agree to them without some kind of an explosion taking place that then creates the environment in which, in fact, we can sit down and craft and agree that we've arrived at the point where we must embrace structural changes. So I'm emphasizing that I don't think we should see this apparent dormancy as going nowhere, because there are obviously lots of currents that are working that may lead in very short order, without us recognizing what has happened, to an environment that's conducive to fundamental change.
Mm-hmm. And all right, so that's your immediate start-off point on the whole question of structural change. I was going to invite you, and perhaps I will after Henry has had his opportunity to react, one, to that comment, and two, in a substantive way, to this whole question of the structural change that may be necessary at this time, and I guess in this particular circumstance, you're talking about engineered change. Henry, I was going to ask you to talk about the whole question of the political culture changing, which is one of the points that you were making when we closed at the last occasion. Henry.
Well, insofar as I can be, well, comment on Vincent's position, let me say that way back in the 16th century, it was well recognized that, indeed, Machiavelli, our friend that we think is so immoral in politics, indeed did say that Rome became powerful not because of consensus, but because of conflictual ideas. That the political process shouldn't be seen as something that essentially should be consensual, but perhaps you see more as the conflictual and the attempt to solve those conflicts that will result in various sorts of development. And indeed, we know from the various revolutions, from the French Revolution coming right now, that effectively you can't foresee everything a revolution going to throw up. Robespierre and all these chaps. So we know that. We know that and we know that situations also that would appear quite dormant and stagnant can certainly become volcanic. So effectively, I have no problem with this sort of context. But my concern is, and by the way, I am not trying to say that any changes we make will know the final outcome. We try to do that as human beings, management of any sort, that you try to see what the end would be. But you know, all kinds of things happen in between there, and what you expected but to be optimal would not necessarily turn out to be optimal, all manner of things. So I accept, I can run with all of that. But with that in mind, or with those, with that context in mind, I still believe that we need to look at our condition at any point of time and try to make changes that will facilitate our growth and development. Look at all the countries that have had conflicts, starting from Austria right back, anywhere. It is the leaders that must sit down and say, let's take a course of action that we believe will help this situation. It might not, and therefore you need to change to make further changes. But many times you will find that, yes, you are on the road to a solution. I think in around 2001, we sat down in a constitutional formation and we made certain changes. They have not worked, in my view. When you look back, in retrospect, it's always, they say 2020 vision. In retrospect, they would not have worked because all they did was democratize the parliament. But the parliament is majoritarian. And therefore, you need now to stand back. The leaders of the country have to do that. Every country I know of, even if it happened after revolutions, if the leaders must sit back and say, hey, what is important here? Is it our interest, or the sectional interest, or the national interest? And that means that we must submerge at points, maybe some sectional interest, but at the end of the day, we must see that the outcome of all of this is for good for the entire people. Now, that is what we need to do. And if we seriously sit back and say that, I deny this nonsense that people say all the time, once you're in power, who does give up power and all this? That's street talk. Look around where the conflicts that have existed. At the end of the day, it's the leaders have to sit down and make. Sometimes they do it after great revolutions and so on. And sometimes they sit down long before and say, we got to deal with the conflict. And I think that needs to be done at this point of time. And as you said, I think actually that needs to be done in terms of our constitution at this point of time.
A good enough place to start. Perhaps what we should do is attempt to isolate What specific elements, and as few as possible, meaning let's prioritize them, as it were. The ones that will treat, or the changes to our constitutional construct, which will treat with the intractable problem of non-inclusion. We're not approaching Article 13 requirements of our Constitution, and which might be assisted if some form of engineering is done. If you were to put, I mean, there are many other issues. People talk about questions of the power of the executive, the chief executive, and all of that sort of thing, and quite a few. The non-transparency is reflected from the operations of, or improper operations of other institutions, governance institutions have been set up, commissions and all of that kind of story. But if you were to just look at the gamut of things which affect the non-approach to a resolution of the issue of inclusion as a society, decision making, sharing of the goods, etc., of the operations of the state, etc. What might that be?
I think myself and Henry are in a sense at one. I don't agree. I don't disagree with what he said either. Of course, the leaders have to be the actors that seek to craft a way forward. In terms of crafting a way forward, I think that there are three areas in which we need to operationalize change. At the level of the Parliament, without any reference to substantive decisions that the Parliament will take, I think that there ought to be a mechanism in the Parliament that forges more consensual decision-making, so that there's probably the need on a number of issues to have the kind of majority that is not majoritorial 50+1, where you can have a 2/3 majority that would in fact impose upon the people involved, if they want to get anything done, to in fact talk and to come to consensus. And I think that can influence to a large extent the way in which matters are addressed and the kind of results that we can get out of Parliament. But I think at the same time, I would still argue the case that in our circumstance, at the level of the executive, there is also probably the need for inclusion which seeks to be largely representative of the outcome of the elections, so that you have a government that's made up of the various parties, reflecting the results of the elections, but one which is driven by a program, so that one of the conditions of the existence of this government must be that they come together, and given the framework I've given for Parliament, that becomes even more possible, and have a program of action. So they're not just there bargaining all the time, ministry by ministry, but programs being undertaken by the ministry should come out of a wider program that they have consensually agreed to. And thirdly, I think the question of decentralization looms large, and that what should be attempted is, as far as possible, to decentralize and have local people conduct their affairs insofar as those affairs can be conducted by them, so that you reduce to a large extent the level of tension that exists centrally, and you allow the people some area and feeling of empowerment, which empowerment I think could have a multiplying effect. But in the first instance, it means that they will have in their own hands their own destiny, based on the fact that at the local level they'll be able to make and implement their own decisions. And I think that those are the three areas in which we need to have change that can be reflected constitutionally to facilitate a completely new way forward for the country. And I think that in that regard, one can then create an environment in which one can attempt to articulate and forge a new political culture.
Mm-hmm. Henry?
Let me say that Yes, I agree that we have to. Remember, I started by saying the constitutional thing. I agree with most of the structural things that needs to be done. But let's ask ourselves, what is the major problem in this society? What is it in our political relations? You know what it is? It is that effectively we want to live in a democracy, but the system does not throw up a democratic government. The democratic government, meaning that effectively that government can be removed ever so often. The government can be voted out of office, so to speak. The nature of our political system, the racial division is allow for the most part one party to be in power over and over and over and over. And that party then does what it thinks necessary for it to stay in power over and over and over. And that must be, by definition, means that it will give what it, largesse and so on, to its supporters. That's the major problem, that the structural thing, the racial, the ethnic structure of the society does not throw up democratic government as we expect. That means a government that would be changed because people, general population mingle, intermix, and change governments because of like and dislike. People vote according to race. Some people want to talk about the ethnic referendum and all this sort of thing. But essentially, that is the problem that Guyana faces. The question is, what do we do about this? You just can't sit down and leave it and say majority rule. That's nonsensical. Indeed, I have never really bought into this nonsense about majority rule. No majority. If we were going to form a constitution today, and you two people decided that you wanted this constitution, you're going to kill everybody that live in happy acres. I don't care what majority you got for that. I rebel. I live in happy acres. Majority rule presupposes the existence of an accepted constitutional relationship. And therefore, if we don't accept on the basic foundation on which we are governed, no majority rule can work. That's why in the American Constitution, they argued that the acceptance of a basic constitution on which we live should always be unanimous. Not just majority, because if we don't accept that, no majority rule can run. And that's what Jetty gets in trouble. I told Jetty that 100 times, I tell anybody. That's what his problem was in the 60s. You cannot make the whole country, or half the country, believe that you're going to run and try to impose a different constitution on them. Then majority rule is not relevant. You can't impose a new constitution the way we live, whether not be a communist or whatsoever, by majority rule. That's not acceptable. And that's the problem. So we have to sit down. Right now, the Constitution isn't working because of the nature of our society. And the nature of our society then determine that we sit down and make the kind of adjustments that would allow governments to be more responsive to all sectors in the society. Some people call it shared governance, whatsoever you like. But that is the major problem facing us. A government must be in a situation where it is forced to respond sensibly to all sectors of the society, depend upon all sectors of society for its survival. If we can't do something like that, well, then we are not in business. As we go forward, minimally, that would require that we change the Constitution so that the president, because you see how much power the president has, the parliament has a majority at this stage, parliamentary opposition, but yet the president can almost, that the president cannot then be elected by 10% of the people in Ghana. That's what our Constitution allows. has let, well, less if things, if there were many parties.
And
I mean,
splitting.
you got a president can be elected at any number of numbers, and he can run a country. I mean, to make sense. Therefore, we have to do like Brazil and sensible places that say at least, at the very least, that the president must be elected by at least 51% of Guyanese if we're going to go forward. I mean, I'm putting that at least. You know, people talk about people like Ravi Dev and all of that, but Ravi Dev did say one time you should have almost a structural majority, like something like 55 or something percent. I don't know that would work, but I'd say at least 51% the president should need to be in the position the president is at this point of time. I'm saying that's minimal. Secondly, I believe in doing so. So you have to reduce the power of the party over the constituencies. You have to change the constituency system in such a fashion, maybe by what they call single transferable votes and all of that, so that you once to give people the opportunity not only simply to vote for their party, but if you give them a second choice to vote for another party, you understand, right? But in a constituency, in the sense that the constituency representatives are responsive to the people in the community and not a political party as it is. So we need to do that. And then we need to go down the road of all the devolution and all of that to give people as certain choices in their community. So I'm saying those are minimal things. I'm not talking about shared governance. I'm not talking here calling into... Indeed, I'm saying that sort of arrangement would give the AFC a massive more opportunity to do things. Because they would have, with 51%, they might really have been in a better position at this point of time. But so I am saying that though, and it forces a president, if he got to go beyond 51%, to work with the other group in more sensible ways. It forces him to, because he can't depend on his constituency alone anymore to get in office. Either, not because the constituency is the majority, but because the constituency is so large that perhaps in terms of turnout it might be the majority. In terms of those who actually vote, it might be the majority. So those are the creative things we have to sit back and say that has to be done in Guyana. They have no for their part, so they want shared governance. Next thing I'm reading, like they want nothing. So I've got it, so, but I believe that that's some of the ways.
I tell you what, we're going to take a short break at this moment. And when we return, Vincent, you will pick this up because Henry has put something quite substantive on the table right now. This specific proposal, as he sees it, treating with the whole question of the rights to the executive and the fact that a plurality of votes cannot necessarily, and always for the benefit of our viewers, that simply means that the largest block, regardless of whether that is 10, 15, 20, 30, 40%, the group, the sole group that controls the largest group of votes has the right to the presidency and all the powers of the presidency. Bear in mind, I know that both of you are suggesting that there are more things than just that need to be changed. But if there was one thing that had to be done, that is something. When they come back, you'll take that as your point of departure, and then we'll take some add-ons. We'll take a break at this time.
Belongs to you and me. When I talk for 2 minutes, I get the next 10 absolutely free with GT&T.
Yes, Vincent.
Yeah, I want really to develop on the point that Henry has made. I really don't have any problem with what he said fundamentally. I think in this process we need to delink the election of the president from the election of the parliament, or to delink the determination of who will be the president from the results in relation to how the parliament is populated. So I think that probably we need to get a system where the president is elected in his own right. Not to the exclusion of reducing some of the powers of the president, but should be elected in his own right. And that in some regards will symbolically start to suggest that this is not a president of a party, but a president of the nation. And if you have a system that seeks to elect a president in his own right, indeed I agree with Henry, that one will have to adopt one of those models which is you see in Europe in some places and in Latin America, where the president must get pass a certain threshold, even if they have to have a runoff, a second round, to determine who the president is going to be. So I do agree that you need a president who is more reflective of the popular will, and that in the Guyana context, it has to be linked from the parliamentary election, because that is where we get trapped. You have a parliamentary election, the party that gets the plurality throws up a president, and that plurality could be a significant minority of the overall vote. So yes, you need to do that. Again, I agree that one needs to work on a constituency system, because really change has to come by virtue of people feeling that there are people to whom they could relate who are responsive and responsible. And that really only occurs in some kind of constituency system where you in fact know who your representative is going to be. And I think that in that regard, the experiment we are going into in local government could throw up some indication of the way in which that system could work, because in our local government system we are going to have 50% constituencies, and these are individual members, individual single-member constituencies, so people will be able to say, that's my representative. And what constituency system provides for also is for individuals who are not necessarily coming from a national party to turn up in the constituency and says, look, I want to speak for you in Parliament. And if the person is sufficiently articulate and popular and people feel confident in that person, you can get a parliament that is far more diversified than the present parliament where you have blocks and nobody breaks rank. Everybody votes in keeping with the whip. You know, you only have to look to the American experience and even the last decision they had, where in the Republic Party so many persons came along and said, all right, we're going to vote to raise the debt ceiling, and so many said no, but they were able to get a decision because there isn't a whip which is saying there's only one way you could vote. And one of the things we need to do is a political system that removes that whip and allow people to exercise their free will and free mind as representatives of a constituency. So yes, that's the other level at which these things need to happen. And that constituency approach, we need to take it right down to the local level. And in my view, at the local level, it should be purely a constituency system that we operate, rather than this attempt to retain a list system, so that you have more people coming through who are not driven. They may be loyal to a party, but not driven in their participation by the diktat of a political party, and really look at interests in the community and respond to those interests as they participate in the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. Just before, don't want to get out too far on this, is there not a potential problem, given the fact that we have ceded so much of the political space to parties and their operations, that even within the context of the local government, the new local government reforms, which we hope will be implemented, because they're not even been signed yet into law, though the Parliament has passed the bills, that the party itself overwhelmingly will not cede that space, even for 50%.
I think that's one of the problems we have, where our parties are not yet willing. They don't have the political will to do what is desired and what is right. And I think that that is partly because I think, in addition to other issues, the two major parties have significant psychological scars. And when you have a scar in the brain, it means that that part of the brain probably doesn't function. So they have significant psychological scars that are inhibiting their ability to see things otherwise. And that's something that we have to overcome. And I think that in that regard, the change has to come from without them than from within them, because within them, simply the psychological state is not permissive. It doesn't allow them to hear anything else. There is, I think, in some regards, there is real fear. Of course, that fear is manipulated by other people and so forth, but I think there is real fear among our political leaders, and that this fear sometimes has been passed down from generation to generation, so it's become a generational issue, that we have this kind of inbred fear of anybody else. But if the system is adjusted in ways that we are suggesting, then the basis for that fear could well recede. It's kind of a chicken and the egg situation, but certainly the fear could recede. And if that fear recedes, then you can get a different person. And what may also be said is that the things we're talking about in themselves will represent the basis for a cultural shift. People wouldn't have to behave the same way. They could very well behave differently.
You know, in Henry, one of Henry's main comments, he talked about, he relegated to street talk questions about the fact that the views that say, for instance, that a man will not deliberately vote himself out of power, and that there was no incentive, as it were, for a group which is in power to want to cede it. And here, I hear you've almost said the change must come from without. Now here we have a situation, and let us return back to the centrally determined construct, the minimum centrally determined construct, which Henry invited us to examine, and that is the manner in which we allocate the executive, not the largest of the smallest of the sums, but by some majority, even if it is simple, but preferably, and left that open structure.
Okay, let me say this, that go Britain, go America. If you decide to run in a Labour constituency, if you're a Labour person and you leave, and you said, I'm going to run as an independent, the Labour Party headquarters stick somebody in there from the Labour Party. They just don't give you free rein to go and say, I'm running as an independent. I was in the Labour Party, therefore I am doing. But as Vincent says, you are developing a culture that Grantley Waljon is with no party. And indeed, the party that represents the constituency of where you live, you used to be with them, but you have stopped, but now you're running as an independent because you have different views to sell to the people. It develops a new ball game, develops a new culture, a new way of looking at it. It's not that the political parties would just say, oh, take over this constituency. But you will have substantial people then can go to the constituencies independent, and some may win. Some may very well win. Maybe you will win. You're on television every day. People know you well. So you will win. And Afnu then got to speak to you.
It's a good thing I'm not in the contest.
Afnu or the PPP will have to speak to you as an independent member. But that's the point. The point is that you develop a different approach, and people in the constituencies that don't necessarily want to go for them have another choice and have a way of looking at things. But more than that, the constituencies are important if they're properly structured, although there's quarrel in the academic literature about the value of this. If they are structured to allow people to vote across race, so that a person might say, if you give them three choices or whatsoever, yes, I can vote. The four choices, I will vote the PPP man because that's my PPP person. But the second vote, I might go with AFC or APNU and so on. And therefore, the Constitution gives you about 2-3 people that you can get that you might find, because you are now giving people the opportunities to do different things in the Constitution. So it's not simply a matter of dealing with the national parties, also a matter of give people the capacity to think that you can vote for another party across the board. So I said that it is not true that it's all cases that people sit down, people decide that they will not give up power. In most cases, it has been so. But you see, in most cases it's been so, and call for street revolution and street action and actual fighting. I think that essentially, at the end of the day, no political party can totally, particularly in political party in the context of where the opposition is in Ghana, they can totally say that will not happen. If a trade union can't strike, it's no trade union. If a political party can't demonstrate, it's no political party. I mean, it's gaffing. It won't live in constitutionalities. It's not practical party. I bet if the Labour Party want to monitor thousands of millions, maybe people on the road in England, I mean, they just don't want it because the Constitution operates in a fashion that they agree with. So if you can't put people on the street, and people don't know that, you really are no political party. And similar go for trade union. You can't strike, forget it, you're no trade union. You got to be able to say to the employer, look, if this don't happen, this will be the result. And therefore, you always have to, don't think about for one moment I'm suggesting that you must not have the capacity to use the kind of force that's necessary at any point of time. But that must be a last, extremely, very last resort for you. And the idea, first of all, I think you have to put out there what you want. I haven't seen that from there. I'm talking up a storm here about all this thing, but I'm not seeing the opposition necessarily saying these things. They are saying they want some things, but I'm not seeing in any detail what it is that they actually want. That we can critique it here, we can say that's wrong, you can call a program, the PPP can say it's nonsense, they can throw it out. The PNC did say something years ago and put out a paper years ago, but since then I have not seen any. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've not seen it. And therefore that's the starting place for where we need to go in Guyana. Because the PPP not going to put up such a paper, that goes without saying.
Yeah, always the option, extra parliamentary option, is always available, and I think the some of it is normally also quite acceptable, and to be revered, because it continues to keep people engaged, ostensibly, and keep people engaged with their representatives.
Arab Spring.
What incentive, and I keep using that word incentive every time, do you see that there is now, or what incentives can be made to be available for the aspirants to political power to want to move to the minimum position that Henry is advocating?
I think that's one of the things that's absent really is leadership in terms of clear and definitive alternatives. And not alternatives in terms of an alternative government, but what the government would do, what the alternative government would do differently. You know, and I think that's one of the areas that needs to be addressed. What they will do differently, starting off from the same issues we're discussing. What kind of constitutional arrangements, what kind of comfort will they provide that people do not presently enjoy by virtue of how they will seek to organize matters of the state. So I think that is a very critical aspect. Now, on the question of extra parliamentary activities, I think that ever so often when people talk about extra parliamentary activities, people get the impression of only one kind of activity. But there are a multitude of extra parliamentary activities which don't necessarily mean going down Regent Street or anything like that. I mean, you have forms of civil resistance and things like that, that the form is completely different, but the impact may well be not dissimilar from if you have a more vociferous approach to extra parliamentary activities. I don't think in Guyana we have sufficiently explored those kinds of extra parliamentary activities, you know, massive signature campaigns on particular issues and things like that seek to galvanize people's involvement in a manner that is also in some regards protective of them, because I think one of the problems people have in Guyana now is that they're fearful of exposure, and there are ways in which they could be involved that doesn't necessarily put them on the front line, but the collective effort could still have the same impact as if they were, in fact, on the front line. And I think that at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with how the electorate feels. How the electorate feels. Does the electorate feel that indeed there are alternatives, indeed that they will not be worse off? And this is a very important question, because a part of the problem in Guyana, which Henry referred to, is the ethnic divide. And whilst there are real differences, on the question of voting, very often it is not those real differences that influence the vote. It is the psychological state that influences the vote. This is my government, and though they're doing the wrong thing, it's my government, it's my people. And if one could work on that, then you could see people who already have different views about how government conducts its affairs behaving differently, so that one has to, in fact, decode the Guyanese people from that psychological imprisonment which is affecting the way they execute their politics.
I tell you, that's kind of interesting. It looks like just where we stopped the last time, that's where we're going to stop. We're getting close to that, because the very last comment which was made in part one is we were talking about trying to effect some good for the body politic. And Henry said, who's your body politic? Where are they? What are they? What do they want? And you have now introduced the idea once again that the body politic needs to be defined and in a certain sense worked at in real ways. Henry, perhaps you might as well, in some of these closing moments, give us a chance to establish the body politic, as it were, the anatomy of the body politic, as you see it now.
It's more the physiology than the anatomy.
You started the way if I remember correctly, you started in a way that almost says to us that Guyana is not really a nation. It's a collective of ethnicities, or whatsoever you want to call it. And I think that more or less answer the question. And Vincent just said that people are concerned. I mean, after all, the PNC had been in office for 28 years, And 1992, they got more vote than the PPP, than the PNC has ever been able to get since then. The black people still going to vote for them, although they were coursing them on the street all the time. People that put up alternative like the WPA end up with 1.6% of the vote. So at the end of the day, people are voting for parties that they believe will give them a certain level of comfort. If you are going to make constitutional change, therefore, you have to be prepared to make the changes that's going to give people comfort. And you have to make changes and live with the leaders the people currently have. You have to get those leaders, sit down with them, and propose to them changes that are acceptable to them. Because if they don't buy it, they go in and sell. They will not go in and sell it. They will not go and sell it properly to their people, and therefore, those leaders are important to the process. I think they call it elite cooperation or whatsoever you want. But you have to get them to sit down and determine where it is we'll get. That's the way forward. That's where we need to go. Well, we have not got there.
Yes.
I would use Martin Carty here, you know. We have options. We either get involved or get consumed. and my view, in consonant to things I've said before, being consumed may take longer. But if we don't get involved, I'm of the firm conviction that we'll be consumed. Right now we're being consumed by crime. And notwithstanding how people politically project crime, all Guyanese are going to be sufferers. And this is happening partly because we have not created an environment that we could create if we dealt with governance and wealth differently. And so we've got to wake up and smell the roses. And if we don't get involved, we are going to be consumed. And the signs of that consumption are here with us. We've had issues of the consumption before, and so we've got to smell the roses.
The PPP just celebrated its 21st anniversary of the victory in 1992 when they ceded the government. Through their spokesman, Dr. Roger Luncheon, there is a view which he adumbrated with, says it's the time perhaps to go back to the polls because the thing is not working. At least we've got very clear statement from Dr. Luncheon which suggests that the current dispensation is not working. Government and governance are not available. Do you agree with his comment that we should probably be going to the elections to try to go to another election to solve this problem?
If Dr. Luncheon wants to go to polls, he don't have to tell you. He can call election. Indeed, if he wants to go to the poll, he should want to catch you on the hop. He shouldn't be telling you this. So let him go. It will solve nothing because the constitutional arrangements remain the same. The alienation will remain the same. But the minute he starts telling you, you got a question if he really wants to go, you should just call it. Well, let's go. That's not a problem.
I respond this way, partly the way Henry's responded, but the other part to say, let him go to the poll, but let him go to proviso. And if what he projects should happen in the poll doesn't happen, that you'll accept he needs to do something different.
Such as accepting as a starting point Henry's proposal that we have been talking here for constitutional reform. Perhaps then I should ask a question. Both of you have only inferentially answered the question whether in fact it was a good idea for him to suggest that we should be going to the polls at this time.
I don't know if it's a good idea for him to suggest, but I don't think it's the worst thing that could happen. It may answer some questions and give us some direction we presently don't have. Or refusing to see.
Yes. But Henry quite explicitly said nothing would have changed. and therefore it would be an extension of the same
Something
story.
would change. The state that he's in would change. Because whilst nothing changes, he will be going to the election with a certain expectation. And if that is not realized, then that something has changed.
I'm going beyond that. I'm saying if even he goes and wins a majority, this country cannot be run the same way anymore. I mean, really. So,
This is therefore the midterm of the government and this parliament. What do you think we should be doing? The parliament resumes its work anytime now. If you had a recommendation to this 10th parliament, what would it be in terms of the way they should be using our funds and our resources over the next little while in their deliberative way? What would that be?
Time to embrace change. So whenever you have the next elections, we have something new.
Parliament is what it is. I mean, we see what's happening there. We see that they can pass whatsoever they want. The president says he's signed what he wants. Indeed, he told them beforehand that anything the parties don't agree with, you can't expect me to sign. The party agreed with some of the local government. Well, all it appeared at first, but now it appears like with only some. So they don't seem to want to sign that. So effectively, Parliament is what it is. It's a place that you go and articulate the views of your constituency, and it should be used as that. It had a good thing to play in terms of the Miley and all of that and thing, but it's not the place to get fundamental changes. Parliament, I said it umpteen time, I was in Parliament and wrote it. I was in Parliament, wrote articles. This is not the place to be if you're looking to a fundamental change. This is a place you go and talk. You make things, but this is not a parliament, not a big thing in our context. You want the changes we want, those are big things. Parliament ain't going to give that to you. It's not going to give it to you.
Well, Parliament might not give it to you, but Parliament eventually has to, if they want to stamp it.
Yes.
For as long as we are committed to a rule of law,
Exactly.
which recognizes that Parliament is a pivotal part of that whole legal process. I tell you, I must get you to quickly cast your eyes to the local government elections. When are we going to have them? When are we going to have them? What would they really tell us when we have them?
My own view, that if we have the local government elections under the system proposed, it provides an opportunity to see the extent to which the absence of two-party rivalry can allow people to take themselves out of the cocoon. I think it's going to be a measure of people's preparedness to say, look, well, this is not PNC versus PPP, and therefore we have an opportunity now to be involved in our own right. And the parties will not be able to engage in the old game of saying he's gone PPP or he's gone PNC. And so it provides an opportunity for a new politic to start engaging.
Yeah, that betrays a certain optimism about the permissive nature of the political parties as far as allowing people to go out there and determine their own state of their lives. But I had let you keep your state of optimism.
No, my only, the only thing it might point to us really might give the new General Secretary of the PPP a benchmark as to where the party is. I mean, that's the only purpose it was served. It was served to all the parties as a benchmark, some kind of, but I don't think it changed much more than that. We'll have new people in the various regional authority. In another year or two, they'll get disappointed, disillusioned, and leave. And we'll be where we are at. So I don't think that this thing going to make any big shakes, but it's good to have them because we should have local government and it should be part of the process. But that's what it will do. It will give the parties some idea of what happened since the next election. You call it midterm. Well, maybe it's a good time to have it, but local government would not change much.
tell you what, it's a note notwithstanding on which we will close this issue of Spotlight. Damned if you don't. Hopefully,
Not
part
damn
two.
if you do.
Damn do.
Yes, damned if you don't. I trust that the listening public would have recognized over the course of these two sessions that the very learned and insightful views of Dr. Henry Jeffrey and Mr. Vincent Alexander have, in a certain sense, pointed to, I hear some people talking about, use words, pathologies and all of that sort of thing in place, but point to the essential areas of difficulties which must be addressed. This program has gone beyond simply identifying what the problems are, but in fact has attempted specifically to throw out in the public domain a particular area which, to my mind, will commend itself to most, if not all, right-thinking people, where we have a situation that our political leaders are saying it's not working. The major political parties are saying that the current operations of the state are not functional. They're all dysfunctional. They're not working. Here and where everyone, the simplest child in the village, can say and refer to the fact that we have to be certain that we encourage everyone by specific pieces of engineering to allow for a greater sense of inclusion. It will not be voluntarily given to any particular group, and it is certainly not to be recommended that it should be seized by any particular group. Perhaps therein lies the incentive that I was trying to pull out of our discussants. There is a side that we should not approach, and on the other side, one that is allows for some good sense and apparent magnanimity, in which case it wouldn't be magnanimity, it would be pure survival.
But in fact, sorry to break the protocol, but it occurred to me when you were speaking that there's something in common between the parties at this point in time, for different reasons. They're both saying it's not working.
Oh yes, oh absolutely. And so it would appear to me that this suggestion which is coming out from this issue of Spotlight, damned if you don't, that we need to have the national discourse take this on board and let us try to work through, put some bones and some muscle to this concept. We are thankful to you gentlemen for assisting us to get to this point. We have to incrementally move this thing forward, and at a much faster rate than we have hitherto done. On this note, let me say good night to all of you and trust that you all start thinking and talking about this story. We must have a majority president, pure and simple, and that is got to be the focus that we all embrace over the next little while. A majority president presumably means that more of us will be included in sharing and conditioning his aspirations and his articulation of what it is best for us. I'll leave it at that for the moment and say good night from Spotlight.